Hello and welcome to New Economic Thinking. I'm here today with Professor Edward Wolff, a professor of economics at NYU. Professor Wolff, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You've recently concluded a paper discussing economic inequality. You started from the period of 1962 and compared the trends to the aftermath of the Great Recession of 2008. What were the main conclusions you came to when you completed the paper?
Well, there was a long period of very robust growth in household wealth, and my work looks at household wealth, which is the assets people own, like homes and stocks and bonds. Household wealth was growing very nicely, very robustly for almost 50 years, from 1962 all the way up to 2007. In fact, if you go back to 1900 even, you find that.
And by growing nicely, do you mean equitably or define nicely? It's not a very economic term.
Well, certainly on average, household wealth was growing robustly for almost over 100 years, except for the period of the Great Depression in the United States. And there it did fall, and then it picked up again and continued to increase, and then you hit the Great Recession, the financial crisis of 2007, and suddenly wealth collapsed. And median wealth, the wealth of the average family, fell by a stunning 44%, almost to where it was back 50 years ago. So you have this period of constant growth, and suddenly this whole process stopped.
And does that apply for all segments of society, or does that apply only for median wealth? I mean, what was happening at the upper echelons?
Well, actually, wealth inequality was pretty stable for about 30, 35 years. There was an uptick from about 1983 to 1989, where the very rich, top 1% in particular, took off from the rest of the population.
And that coincided with the first, I won't say attack, but minimization of the progressivity of the tax system during that period.
Actually, yes. That was during the Reagan years, and you had these two very steep tax cuts, particularly for the very wealthy, and correspondingly, you had wealth inequality zooming up during those years. You also had a stock market boom. Wealth inequality is very sensitive to what happens in the stock market, and but then it stabilized until about 2007.
And what were the reasons for the stabilization? Because the normal, I won't say caricature, but the normal pattern one here is that you've had over the last couple of centuries, you had growing inequality, minimized in the aftermath of the Great Depression and then the post-war period, and that trend continued until about the 1980s, when it began to expand again. And what you're suggesting is that in the 1990s there was some abatement of this trend towards greater inequality.
Yes, what you're referring to is for income, and
yes,
that's absolutely true. But wealth takes a different trajectory, and the reason is that it's very sensitive to what happens in the stock market, but even more so, what happens to home prices versus stock prices, because the principal asset of the middle class is their home, and the major assets of the rich are stocks and businesses and financial assets. So if you have stock prices rising relative to house prices, that leads to increased inequality. On the other hand, if housing prices are moving stronger than stock prices, then that actually reduces inequality.
Although in that situation, don't you think it's a bit of a fool's gold? Not to be critical of the characterization, but if you look back at that period in the early 2000s, it was predicated largely on a housing bubble and a lot of these exotic and toxic derivatives that created this, if you like, an artificial boom in housing. And you could argue that it set the stage for an even greater level of inequality in the aftermath of the Great Recession.
Well, I think that's a very excellent point, and in fact, there was a housing bubble. But leading up to that housing bubble, people, as we traditionally define household wealth, it was growing pretty steadily for middle class families. What counterbalanced that actually was that they were also taking out more and more debt, and in fact, one of the reasons for this rise in wealth inequality during the Great Recession was that the middle class had taken on this enormous debt. In fact, their debt-to-income ratio almost tripled between 1983 and 2007.
So in that sense, I know you focus primarily on wealth, but in that sense, looking at income is important because there is an argument, I think Steve Fazari and Barry Cinnamon amongst others have made this argument that the stagnant growth of incomes and wages during this period, the 1980s through to the 2000s, forced people to take on an increasing amount of debt in order to sustain their living standards.
Yes, no, I think that's exactly correct. And in fact, I think that's what you find because particularly middle income families were basically using their homes as ATM machines, and they were taking on increasing debt. Their living standards were not growing, and their other assets were not growing. So they were using this money they took out of their homes just to maintain their normal level of living. And so by 2007, they had developed this enormous debt level. And so when the housing bubble finally burst, what happened was that because of this, this debt, this leverage, this excess leverage, their wealth plummeted even more than the housing prices did. So housing prices fell 24%, but their wealth, their net worth, fell by 44%. And this was a direct result of this heavy debt that they had accumulated.
So to go back to the overall findings, you're not, to be clear, you're not suggesting that we have to continue to revive bubbles in order to mitigate wealth inequality. That's clearly not a desirable way to do that, even though that was one of the effects of the housing bubble in the early 2000s. So what would you advocate, or what was it in the post-war period which made that growth more sustainable and in fact helped to reduce wealth inequality?
A lot of it is, of course, based on income inequality. So if income inequality remains steady, then wealth inequality, all other things being equal, will also tend to remain stable. But you don't have to have a bubble for housing prices to grow. In fact, through most of the post-war period, housing prices were increasing, and this augmented the wealth of the middle class. So it was only the period from about 2000 to 2007 when housing prices really exploded and caused this bubble. And as I said, when the bubble burst, then the wealth of the middle class just plummeted. So from a policy perspective, you want to maintain fairly steady growth in home prices and asset prices, but the main thing to maintain a level, to maintain level wealth inequality is that you have to keep the debt of the middle class fairly constant, and so it's sort of a vicious feedback cycle. So any income inequality was growing. Median income, average living standards were stagnant. So this kind of forced the middle class to draw on more and more debt.
And it seems to me that the flaw, the policy failure in the aftermath of the Great Recession, particularly amongst monetary policymakers, is that seems that there has been this attempt not to reconstruct the economy along more income-based lines, but to recreate the status quo ante and sort of recreate more asset bubbles in order to generate growth. So it does seem to me that that's not going to lead towards a happy outcome if we follow through on the recent history, if that's anything to judge by.
Well, I think, housing prices have recovered from 2010 to 2013. For example, they grew by 8%, which is a fairly sustainable level of growth. I agree that if monetary policy stokes another bubble, you're going to have the same kind of process repeating itself. You're going to have the middle class starting to increase its debt burden. You're going to have their leverage increasing.
Has there been any progress made in the aftermath of 2008 towards private sector deleveraging, particularly amongst the middle class?
Well, in fact, yes, the debt levels of middle class families has fallen. Part of it is unfortunately due to the fact that credit has been heavily constrained. But that's probably a good thing in the long run. So one of the consequences of the financial crisis was that banks really cut back on credit supply. They tightened up credit standards. So mortgages were cut back. Leading up to the financial crisis, of course, we had this huge expansion of credit in from banks and financial institutions. You had subprime loans. You had no documentation loans. Banks were just handing out money, and this actually led to a fairly strong increase in the home ownership rate. But that was built on fool's gold, because as soon as the economy went into recession, families could no longer afford to.
And they were burdened with very, very fragile forms of debt, low quality debt as well. What has actually happened to personal household savings in the last 4 or 5 years? You say there's been some deleveraging. I guess the correlative to that is that there's been an increase in household savings.
Yeah, the official statistics do show that the savings rate, which had plummeted to almost zero during period leading up to the Great Recession, have actually started to pick up again. I mean, part of it is forced because there's no credit available.
What's the number right now, ballpark?
Maybe on average, it's about 3 or 4%.
Which is about where it would have been in the early to mid '90s, for example.
Yeah, that's about right. So personal savings are rising, and eventually, I think, hopefully, the economy will start to resume a normal trajectory. The home ownership rate did plummet quite a bit for middle-income families. It fell by 10 percentage points. That was a huge drop, and so the effort to promote actually started under Clinton, what was called the Ownership Society, and later under George W. Bush. I mean, I think it was a legitimate effort to try to increase home ownership, but to do it by issuing these substandard mortgages. The disaster was just around the corner, and then of course the financial sector collateralized this debt, so they were happy to issue it. And
has that really changed enough? I mean, do we want to reestablish? I mean, is home ownership, is that still a good social policy goal given the instability that flowed out of that in the late 2000s, or should we be looking at another way to augment incomes and overall economic wealth? Is there a better way than promoting housing, for example?
Well, I mean, housing has all kinds of indirect benefits. I mean, what you find is that people who own their own home, of course, have that as part of their wealth, but it also leads to a greater accumulation of other forms of wealth. You have a mortgage, you have to pay it down. You have to kind of forces households to do some savings.
But there is an argument, for example, that now that we've gone through the post-baby boom period, that the demographic demand for housing, the profile is changing, it's diminishing somewhat. And given the prevailing high levels of inequality, both on a wealth and income front, it's much harder for first-time buyers to step up to the plate and acquire property right now. So this is why I ask whether that's actually a realistic and attainable goal as a social policy.
We've if you go further back in time, certainly from the end of World War II to 2000 maybe, home ownership rate was steadily increasing. I mean, and most of these families were at pretty secure finances, and so it's certainly doable. I think the experience of the 2000s may have cast a pall over that kind of process, but I still think home ownership is an important goal. As long as it's financed correctly
And regulated correctly as well.
Yeah.
Is that more the provenance of the Federal Reserve, or should that be a fiscal policy stance?
Well, I think both have to play a role. I mean, the Federal Reserve Board has to set banking standards, but it also sets the interest rate. I mean, the interest rate, of course, has been extraordinarily low. Just popped up a little bit recently, but so it makes mortgages affordable anyway. I mean, the key factor in explaining homeownership is affordability of mortgages, plus, I should add, the availability of credit. So
which hasn't really returned to any great degree, as you were saying before.
Yeah, well, I think banks are starting to loosen up a bit, and I think unfortunately banks are and financial institutions are trying to collateralize the mortgage debt again. But I think if the Fed sets the correct standards, financial standards, I think this process is actually sustainable, and I think the experience of the Great Recession may actually be an anomaly, and but it will take a while. It'll take a while for families to recover from sort of the shock. It's sort of like this tsunami hit American families. I mean,
they're still recovering from the effects of that, actually. So.
Yeah.
Well, fingers crossed that your assessment is correct and that we can restore something close to the halcyon post-war period. Professor Edward Wolff, thank you very much for joining us today. It was most interesting.